basically, the realms of waking sleep are also come from our family, our culture, and society. When I think of family, I mean, all our families are different, as I've mentioned. And culture, we have so many different cultures, not only our ethnic culture, but we have our economic culture. We have our geographical culture that we have to consider. We have to consider if we grew up in a military family. Um, and when we look at these different areas, education even, what was the educational level of our parents, and those kinds of factors are going to impact the way that we see our lives. Society itself, I look at society as being the mass media and the contribution of those sources of mass media to who we are and how we see the world. So, of course, depending on the time in which you grew up, you're going to see the world a little differently depending upon the events that occurred when you were growing up. So society, like I said, the mass media, you have the radio, you have internet especially now, you have TV, you have newspapers, you have magazines, books, all those things. So when you think about who you are and why you are the way you are, we have to factor that in too. And of course, gender, whether you're male or a female, especially in the American society in the United States, women have broken through the barrier, but we still are not in parity with men. And that's just the fact of the way it is, because women were not even given the right to vote until the 1920s. So we've not had a voice in the ways and the rules that we have to live by, and yet we had to live by those rules. And so that was one of the real turning points for women and for gender. And then when you look at the sexual revolution of the 60s, we had a lot of changes then that occurred. So, taking into consideration what our gender is as well as when we were living is going to form basically how we see ourselves and what we believe about ourselves. Um, One of the best ways in which you can begin to awaken is to begin to ask yourself some questions. One of my favorite ways of looking at my own soul story is to ask myself questions. And by asking those questions, I'm not necessarily demanding that I find the answer, but that the fact that I ask the question opens my mind up to begin to look at what the possible contributions have been to that particular answer that I might come up with. So who am I? What do I want? Why do I want it? When I say questioning the question, I'm talking about who am I? You know, am I who I think I am? Am I who you think I am? Am I finished? Am I done? When am I done? How will I know if this is the real me? So what I'm doing is I'm questioning the question. I start with a question and it leads to more questions. So then my next question is, what do I want? Well, how do I know that I want it? Why do I want it? Who told me I should want it? Do I need it? Why do I think I need it? And then the next one, what is my purpose? Do I need to have a purpose? What is my purpose? What would be meaningful to me? How will I know that it's my purpose and I'm not just living my parents' life? Why was I born? I don't know why I was born, except I think that it was to find out my soul purpose. So that's my particular answer. But I went through this whole query of why was I born? I was born because mom and dad wanted to have me, or mom and dad had me, they conceived me, and so therefore I was born. That's why I was born. But is there a larger purpose to why I was born? That's a real intriguing question. What do I believe in? Why do I believe in it? Should I believe in it? Does it work for me? Does it help me? What influences me? Why does it influence me? Where will I go and who will go with me? I love those two last questions. I love Sam Keen, who said basically those two questions, where will I go and who will go with me? He says you have to ask those questions in the right order. Because if you ask them in the wrong order, you're basically asking somebody to go along with you, and you don't even know where you're going. So the soul's journey really asks us to retrace our steps. We have to recover what we value. We have to, some of the things we discarded along the way were discarded because it didn't bring us the kind of approval and love that we really needed. And so we let it go, and we thought, well, that's not me. And yet, as we go on this journey for the search of your soul and your soul's story, do you think that there's something maybe you left behind that would be really of value to you right now? And it's part of your bliss. Joseph Campbell told us, follow your bliss. What did he mean by that? I really think he meant that we need to um, find out what is meaningful to us, what we love, and then follow our heart. That means that we get to live from our highest potential and be an awakened self. So all of this, to me, all of this culminates, that as we start to look at this whole um, configuration of how we're going to wake up to our soul story, when I look at that whole configuration, to me, it constitutes our personal mythology. Our personal mythology is that mythology that we have basically been living by. David Feinstein and Stanley Krippner were the originators of this concept, and they popularized it, and they influenced me in their writings and now in person, um, to I based my whole psychological career on the whole idea of what is a personal mythology, what is my personal mythology, what is yours? Is there a difference between male and female personal mythologies, and if so, what is that? So I got my master's thesis built upon that. I got my master's degree based upon that. I've got my doctoral degree based upon codependence as a personal mythology. So a personal mythology, by looking at a personal mythology and the way that it works and the way that we can begin to revise what our story is, I think that it's a very useful paradigm to guide us in this process. So again, all the stories that we live by, whether they're conscious or unconscious, that constitutes our personal mythology. And of course, we can break that personal mythology down into those respective um, lenses where we're looking at, well, what is my personal mythology in regard to relationships? What's my personal mythology in regards to my career? What's my personal mythology in regards to being a woman? What's my personal mythology in regards to being an elder? What is my personal mythology in regards to being a mother? All those things need to be examined so that I can begin to live the life that I want to live rather than living the life that I think people want me to live. The interesting thing about a personal mythology is that there's really a process that occurs, and I love the way that David Feinstein and Stanley Krippner described this, and that they told us that when our myths need revision, what'll happen, what we can expect is that there's going to be a counter myth that's going to pop up. So, for example, if we were if we felt we were very dependent when we were younger, and we were dependent in our relationships, and all of a sudden that's not working for us, we would generally go to the opposite end, and now we're going to be ultra independent. In other words, I'm not going to need anybody to help me now. I asked for too much help, now I'm going to do it by myself. Well, as in anything, black and white, neither polar end of the extreme works for us. So what we need to do is examine what is the content of each of those polar ends of the extreme, and then come back and examine that gray area in between so that we can create an updated revision of our personal mythology. And believe it or not, our personal mythology needs revision throughout our lives because we're always changing. Things are always changing. Our needs change. We grow in our capacity, and so therefore our needs change. And so we have to stay open-minded and realize that when we are, bucking, maybe bucking the way in which we had seen the world, that maybe doing the complete opposite isn't exactly going to work for us, although that's going to be our inclination, that maybe it might be better to incorporate the best of both worlds and then incorporate anything new that might be of use to us. So this last part of this webinar, what I wanted to do was to be able to walk you through what I am going to assign you. Besides, you've got the homework now of questioning the question, and I really encourage you and hope that you will sit down with a piece of paper or pieces of paper and start asking yourself questions. In other words, you don't have to know the answer. You just need to write down the question. Who am I? Where am I going? Who will go with me? What do I need? Why do I need that? Why do I feel the way that I do? All those questions will lead us towards answers, and then you can use those questions to begin to help you in your journalizing. Because that's the other thing I recommend that you do, is that you buy a journal and you start journalizing your journey so that you can keep track of where you have been, where you're going. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful roadmap. I've collected years and years and years of journals, and the one thing that I found a little disheartening, but it was also at the same time very enlightening, is that the stories were the same. I kept telling the same stories, even though the characters might change. And so when I looked at it that way, I realized, you know what, it's not the characters within the story necessarily that need to be looked at, but what is the story itself that I'm living? What kind of choices am I making that are keeping me locked in, telling these same stories over and over again? So that's one piece of homework that you have. And the other piece of homework that I want you to think about, and that I will provide you information for, is to look at your psychological type. Carl Jung believed that our attitudes of introversion and extroversion were something that were, in a sense, unique to us. And that when he looked at the world, he said that basically that he kept thinking that that people or theories had been formed that had explained behavior based upon what we observed in a person rather than what the person, him or herself, was actually experiencing. So his theory is very different in that sense, in that when you look at his theory, you're looking at it from the inside out instead of the outside in. And by knowing your Jungian psychological type, I really believe this can help you align your decisions with your deepest soul needs, because you're going to be making decisions based upon your strengths. So let's start looking at what those strengths are. Well, first of all, we're either an introvert or an extrovert according to Jung. He talked about this whole idea that there are two types of people in the world. There's one type, which he called the extrovert, where basically they rush into new situations and they're always, they embrace what is new, and they're not timid at all. They go out into the world and it's a challenge for them, and they like what is out there. They are more attracted towards that which is outside of them. And that's why the extroverted, when I talk about the focus and the flow of libido, the libido is the fuel for the psyche. So in the extrovert, that libido flows outward and towards the objective and away from the inward part of yourself and the subjective, which is the realm of the introvert. So the difference between the introvert and the extrovert is that the introvert focuses the flow of libido towards themselves. So if there is a new situation or they're in a situation, it's not the situation that they're going to look at. They're going to look at how that situation translates within them. I'll give you a real good example. My example of introversion and extroversion comes from my experiences with one of my extroverted friends, Kay. And when we first met, she was the extrovert, I was the introvert. She was coming and seeking me out. And I was, being the introvert, I was hanging back and going, well, what does she want? I don't know if I want to get involved. I don't know, and I was just very reluctant. But she talked me into going to what is called the Prune Festival. At the time, it was called the Prune Festival in our area, and it's now called the Dried Plum Festival. But anyway, we went to the Prune Festival, and I had just started teaching at Yuba College, and there were I knew that there would be people that were in my class that would be there, and I was a little, reticent and a little shy about the whole thing. But what I ended up doing is I went with her, and when I did see a student of mine when we first walked in, I thought, oh, there's so and so. Wonder what she's up to. Wonder what he's up to. And then I turned around and looked for my friend Kay, and she was like way over somewhere else talking to someone else she had seen. She didn't even bother to tell me, hey, I'm going over here. But, her extroverted nature drew her towards that experience because that's what extroverts do. So I'm sure there's introverts and extroverts out there in my group right now. And you introverts are probably going, aha, that's me. But let me say something, too, that our world, our society prefers the extrovert. It's the extrovert that gets all the recognition because, of course, an introvert doesn't even want to be recognized. The introvert is more about staying within. So isn't it ironic that here I am on a webinar with you, bringing attention to me when really I want the attention to go to you, okay? So remember, if you're an introvert, you probably feel like you're different from everyone in the world and that there's something wrong with you. But remember, that's a judgment of society because society has preferred the extrovert, okay? And that's not to put the extrovert down, but to put it in perspective for the introvert. The other way that this Jungian typology will help you to understand your behavior and to help you to understand your soul story, actually, so that you begin to make choices that reflect your strengths, I want you to first look at what Jung called the functions of consciousness. He said these were like the 4 ways of knowing. We think about the world, we have our intellect, we have our logic, we use reason, we use outside criteria, we evaluate things according to the way that they have been described to us. Okay, so when we were told that a certain type of person is not to be trusted, that is what we catalog. We think, oh, we see that person and we think, oh, not to be trusted, okay? And then we go to the feeling component. Well, of course, the feeling component there would be, well, what is the emotion? What is the emotion that is elicited in that particular interaction that you're just having or that stimulus that you just encountered? Do you like it? Don't you like it? Does it make you mad? Does it make you happy? Does it make you sad? What is that feeling that is attached to whatever it is that you're looking at or you're examining? Those are what Jung called the evaluative functions because they evaluate the world. They rank order the world in a hierarchical fashion. The perceptual functions, however, don't judge. They don't evaluate. They only bring in information for us. So we have the sensation, the S in your typology. We're going to be looking at your typology, and when you see your typology, the 2 letters on the will be on the inside are either going to be T and S or T and N or F, depending if it's feeling, or it could be sensation, it could be S. So intuition is indicated with an N in the typology, okay, rather than an I, because I is already designated to introversion. But anyway, so the perceptual functions are those things that take in the information in the world. We take in information through our eyes, our ears, our nose, our mouth, through touch, through movement. And also the other perceptual function is the intuition. So the intuition helps us to go one step beyond. We look for meaning through our intuition. Our intuition tells us, well, this might mean, or the possibilities inherent in this situation may be. So when we're looking to the future, when we're trying to ascribe meaning to a situation, we're really using our intuition. So I'm going to send you out to a website where you are going to take a test. It's 102 questions where you can take your test to get your own typology. Some of you already have your typology, so that's great. You won't have to do that unless you want to do it just to see if maybe your answers have changed since you took that original test. But what you'll find, and I'm going to give you an article that explains this, so you can read that article first before you actually try to look at your typology in a decision-making tree, okay? My whole purpose here is to help you form a decision-making tree where you're going to use your strongest functions, understanding what your strongest functions are, and that those stronger functions are really the ones that you can rely on to give you an accurate interpretation. So on this particular slide that you have in front of you, I have categorized them. Actually, Jung categorized them as your preferred functions and your submerged functions. The preferred functions are the letters that you're going to see in the middle of your typology. Okay, so let me just go to this next slide for a second, but you'll see that, for example, for the INFJ, this person's an introvert. This person has the two functions of intuition and feeling that are either primary and secondary, and then there's a J on the end, which tells you which of these particular functions is primary, okay? So if you go back to this last slide, you see the J, the judging functions are, we have to go back one more slide. The judging functions are actually thinking and feeling. So if you look at this slide over here, thinking and feeling, well, thinking isn't there, so feeling is, the J indicates that the number one primary function for this type is feeling. So once you've identified your primary function, you can actually easily identify the other ones. The one right next to it is your secondary function. In this case, it's intuition. Now, what you don't see are these two functions down here, sensation and thinking, because they're submerged. Okay, so we go back here to the submerged functions, which are your tertiary and your inferior function. So as you begin to look at your typology, realize you're not going to see all four functions, but realize that they are there. They're there in the sense that it's hierarchical, that if you are going to trust your functions to help you make decisions, informed decisions, then you need to go through the functions and what they tell you in order to come to a very well-rounded analysis of what it is that you're thinking about, okay? So, as I said, this J in this particular typology, INFJ, the J indicates that it's the judging function that's primary. Again, I'm going to take you back here for a second because the judging functions are only thinking and feeling. So, when I get here and I'm an INFJ, I know that the J is going to indicate either an F or a T. In my typology, this is my typology, feeling is my primary function. That tells me my intuition will back up my feeling function. Next, I would rely on what my body tells me. Last of all, I would use my logic. Now, isn't that funny? Because here I am, an educator, and I think all the time. But when it comes to making personal decisions, this is the hierarchy I need to use. 1, 2, 3, and 4. I need to first explore what are my feelings about the situation. What does my intuition tell me about the meaning and the possibilities of the situation? What does my body tell me? Do I feel to have butterflies? Is my throat tightening up? Do I have a headache? Do I have a stomach ache? Is my back hurting? Those are important kind of bodily indicators. I don't like the smell of whatever it is where I am? Do I appreciate the sights of what I see, but I don't really like what I hear? Okay? And then last of all, in this hierarchy, it tells me that thinking is actually my less developed function. So what does this mean? Let me just say this for a second, that if you are looking at your preferred functions or your submerged functions, think of them as a family. Your primary function is the eldest and the wisest. Your secondary function is the next eldest. The third function, tertiary function, is the third youngest in the family, and the inferior function is your baby. Your baby knows the least amount in the family, right? The baby is the least developed. Not that they're the least intelligent, it's just that they haven't had the experiences, they haven't had the skill development in order to provide you with a lot of informed information. So when we look at our typology, we have to look at what our hierarchy is. And then that way we can start making decisions that first exhaust, basically, for this particular typology, my typology, when I make a decision and I'm confused, what's a good decision to make, I have to really ask myself, well, how do I feel about this? Because that's really the most important. Even the society will tell me that, you know what, feeling, that's illogical. Don't do that. You should be thinking. But, look at my typology. A T tells me that thinking is the worst thing I can do because that's the baby of the family. I'm not going to trust the baby to make the decision for me. So what I need to do is I need to trust my feelings, that my feelings are accurate for me. My intuition will tell me what's the meaning of this situation. What are the possibilities inherent in this decision that I'm trying to make. The feelings, and in a sense it backs up my feelings. So it either supports it or it will refute it. Hopefully it'll support it because then it'll make me feel stronger about the decision that I'm making. Again, third, I would listen to the third eldest in the family, and last of all, I will go to my thinking. Now, let me tell you something that happens to feelers oftentimes. Oftentimes, feelers will talk themselves out of their feelings because they've been told by society that feeling is inferior to thinking, and so therefore, if you've been feeling, if you're basing your decisions upon your emotions, then you need to switch and get into your head and get out of your emotions. I mean, isn't that what a lot of us been told? So what will happen for an INFJ like me, where you allow thinking to take over, is that you're going to make decisions that don't work out for you. You're going to make decisions that don't necessarily give you the favorable outcome that you were looking for because you really didn't base it upon what is true for you. And what's true for you as a feeler is your feelings. I've done this again for if someone has a P on the end of their typology, then now we look at how this hierarchy changes. The P indicates, again, that it's the perceptual function that is going to be primary. So if I go back here again to look at the perceptual functions, the perceptual functions are sensation and intuition, and those two would be the ones that would appear if it's a perceptual function. So when I'm looking at the P on the end, I have to ask myself, well, which is the perceptual function here that is showing? It's the N. So therefore, the intuition is my primary function. My secondary function would be feeling. It backs up my intuition. When you look at what is submerged, now again, I'm making this sort of a square. I'm not crossing over and saying it's 1, 2, 3, 4. It's 1, 2, down 3 because it's the same. Feeling and thinking are both judging perceptions or judging functions, so they're of the same category. So what backs up, what in this particular typology, what would happen is that intuition being first, feeling being second, thinking third, and then sensation would be last. In other words, this person really should not rely on their senses to make the decision. That's the baby of the family. Rely first on what are the possibilities, what's the meaning of this situation, what is the, we're looking at things that, the reasons for something happening. So we need to explore that first. So in a decision-making hierarchy, this particular person would first ask themselves, what is the meaning and the possibilities of this situation? What does this mean? What can happen from this? What can't happen? Examine all those questions. And the next thing would be, well, how do I feel about it? How do I feel about this situation? Do I like it? I don't like it. Does it make me happy? Does it make me sad? And then next would be the logic, applying the criteria of society to that. In other words, well, if I make that decision, then what does society tell me about it? What does, what does an objective criteria say about this particular choice that I'm looking at? And then last of all would be the sensation. What's the color? What's the smell? What does my body tell me? Do I get a headache about it? I sort of like this whole idea of looking at a car, okay? So if I want to get a car, and I'm trying to decide, man, I want to get a Volkswagen or do I want to get a Mercedes? Okay, maybe I've got the money for a Mercedes now. But the thing is, my being an INFJ, I have to ask myself first, how do I feel about the Mercedes? How do I feel about the Volkswagen? And when I look at the two, I'd say, you know what? I really like the Volkswagen because it really has a lot of sentimental value for me. I used to have one, and even though it wasn't a very good car, I really liked it. Okay? Now, if I were to quickly go to my thinking function instead, and I were to ask myself, well, what do I think? What do I think would be the better decision? Should I get a Volkswagen or a Mercedes when I've got the money to do both? I could say, well, the Volkswagen is cheaper, but it doesn't run very well. It's not as prestigious as a Mercedes. The Mercedes gets maybe the same amount of mileage. The Mercedes is a more prestigious car. It costs more. Parts cost more. That's a negative. But this whole thinking criteria is not the criteria I need to use because it's my weakest. So I have to weigh my feelings first. My intuition tells me the possibilities and meanings of making the choice of, liking the Volkswagen more. The meaning is that, you know what, I'll probably be happier in this decision because it bring back good memories, you know. Um, the sensation, I'm excited. I like the color of the one that I see. I like the colors that are offered. I like the sound of a Volkswagen. My Mercedes, I used to have a Mercedes, and that sounded like a diesel truck, so I didn't really like that. But then last of all, basically to make a decision about this car is to then examine what does society think about the Mercedes versus the Volkswagen. And then I have a weighting criteria. I have a weighting criteria where I'm going to make my feelings the most predominant. I hope that all makes sense because what I'm going to provide you with now is basically this link to where you can take the Myers-Briggs, and it's 102 questions, and be sure to print out your results, okay? Otherwise, you're going to have to take it again, because what you're going to see in the a percentage in your results is that there'll be a split between the percentage of your introversion and extroversion. So maybe you're only 48% introverted and 52% extroverted. That means pretty much that you're almost balanced, okay? But if you look at your next criteria, the next function would be thinking and feeling. If your feeling criteria is 74% and the other criteria is 26%, then you've got you've got a weighting there that tells you that that what's going to be best for you is to look at your feelings and not your thinking, because it's already telling you that in your typology. And then also what I'm going to do at the end of the seminar is I'm going to, in fact, I'm going to do that right now. I am going to put up these files for you where you can download this file here, okay? And when you all you need to do is come over here and click this download arrow, and it'll download onto your computer. And if you want to see what this particular document is, it is a document. It's actually a chapter that I have in a book that is published by National Social Science Press, and it tells you about the psychological types. It tells you about the attitudes. It tells you about their functions. It tells you about okay, you can see right here, rational functions, the hierarchical nature of the functions. So it's a pretty explanatory document that should help you. And then it also goes into the 8 major types. So even though we're looking at 16 types, it goes into the 8 major types that Jung had talked about. The other document I'm going to provide you with is basically what I call a decision-making tree, and I've outlined for you that depending on your typology, what I want you to do is I want you to think of a problem. I want you to, when you face a problem, go through this hierarchy according to your typology and write it out. For example, like I said, if you are an INFP, your decision-making tree is going to list intuition first, then feeling, then thinking, then sensation. And so you would be writing out your intuitive, uh, your intuitive take on what it is that you're examining. Then you're going to, and then after you've exhausted that, then you go to your feelings. How do I feel about this? Do I like it? Don't I like it? What kind of emotions does it evoke in me? Third, you're going to be asking yourself, what is the objective criteria that most people would use to make this decision? Okay? And then last of all, for this particular person is, what does your body tell you? Okay? So I'm really hoping that this this webinar has been helpful to you, and that I will see you again in on August 22nd, when we are going to go through the second part of this seminar, which will be called Finding Spaces for the Soul to be Present. Okay, so thank you very much for joining me. I'm going to check out now, but I'm going to leave this site open for you so that you can download your documents. And I will send you an invitation to the next webinar, and please sign up. Okay, thanks a lot. Take care, and